welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to our morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Karl Kaiser Forum here at DGAP. This week's morning briefing is somewhat special. We usually focus on one topic relevant to German foreign policy. Originally, we wanted to look at Ukraine for an update on the military situation, the resilience of civilian life, as well as Western support. And we will still do that, but given the escalating conflict in the Middle East, we also wanted an update on that conflict and on the relations between the two. And these relations are hard to overlook. On the one hand, one might argue that the US-Israeli war on Iran is another setback for Russia, which has in the past benefited, for example, from Iranian drones. On the other hand, Russia could actually be the real winner, as energy prices are up, military capabilities are diverted, and political attention on Ukraine is declining. In fact, the US government postponed upcoming peace talks. As the price of oil exceeded $100 per barrel on Monday, US President Donald Trump started easing certain restrictions on Russian oil. Now, despite weeks of Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine and severe weather conditions, Ukrainians are continuing to defend their country and launching successful counterattacks. In the process, Ukraine has developed a range of new military technologies and defenses capabilities. In fact, Ukraine is now helping out the US-Israeli effort, for example, by providing interceptor drones and operators to protect US bases in Jordan. In other words, there are lessons from the battlefield that Europeans had better learn to strengthen their own security. What are these key military developments? How resilient is Ukraine's military and society? How to equip Europe with the necessary means to deter future conflict? To discuss these and other questions, I'm delighted to introduce an excellent panel today, which I should mention is unfortunately missing Olivia Cortas, who had to cancel on very short notice and sends her apologies. We still have three excellent speakers, though, starting with Dr. David Jalilvand, who's an associate fellow at the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia here at DGAP. He runs the Berlin-based research consultancy Orient Matters, specializing in geopolitics, economics, and energy in Iran and the Middle East. He has worked previously with the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, completed a doctoral dissertation at Freie Universität Berlin, and he just published a piece on the Iran war as a test case for Germany's international credibility, co-authored with András, co-authored with Stefan Meister, which is out in German only, but which my colleagues will be happy to share in the chat. Next up will be Dr. András, who's a senior fellow at DGAP Center for Security and Defense, a co-founder and I think record participant of this morning briefing series. So welcome back, András. You have spent in excess of 100 days in Ukraine since the outbreak of hostilities in 2022, and I think have disturbing and interesting news to share. So welcome back, András. Last but not least, Dr. Élie Tenenbaum is Director of Security Studies Center at Institut français des relations internationales, Ifri, our dear friends in Paris. Élie holds a PhD from Sciences Po and also held visiting fellowships at Columbia University and the War Studies Department at King's College London in the past. He's a specialist on irregular warfare, European security and defense policy, and has recently co-written an extensive report based on findings in Ukraine on military technology. So we're looking forward to hear about that as well. Now, before we begin, the usual disclaimer and reminder, we would like to remind everyone that we are recording this session and uploading it subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks and then open up for Q&A. If you have a question or comment, please raise your hand, briefly introduce yourself, and keep your questions or intervention relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues in the events and communications teams and elsewhere here at DGAP, helping to put this briefing and this series together. Now, without much further ado, let me hand things over to you, David, to kick us off. If you could say a few words about where we are in the US-Israeli war against Iran since the attacks. You could say a few words about regime stability, perhaps, and also about the broader security implications. Over to you, David.
Well, thank you, Jan, and good morning, everyone. A pleasure to be with you on this call. We are now almost 2 weeks into a joint Israeli-US campaign against Iran that saw an initial phase focusing on decapitation strikes against the Iranian political and security leadership, that focused on strikes against radar positions and missile launchers with the apparent objective to secure air superiority over Iran and to break the chain of command inside the country. Over time, and by now, this campaign has expanded towards broader targets, focusing on missile and drone production sites, on the broader security apparatus, also the Iranian Navy, and in some respects also on the Iranian nuclear program, even though this does not seem to be a particular priority focus of the current campaign as we see it today. It's important to note, I think, that both Israel and the US are obviously fighting side by side, and they are coordinating their attacks. However, I think they do not share necessarily the same strategic objectives when it comes to the war on Iran. Israel is very keen to weaken Iranian capabilities to the maximum possible extent, possibly even leading towards a regime change or a collapse of the regime. The US objectives seem to be more limited, focused on military capabilities, and beyond that, over the past almost 2 weeks, we heard a very broad range of, to put it mildly, also inconsistent strategic objectives that were put forward by the Trump administrations. You had at the very beginning a notion of regime change. Trump soon entertained the possibility of a deal. You heard reports about arming the Kurds or non-arming the Kurds. You had on the same day conflicting statements of whether or not this is just the beginning of the war or the end. So there is a bit of confusion as to what the US seek to realize with that war. That aside, I think the big question looming over the campaign is what are the strategic objectives that can be achieved with military means? And here I think there are a lot of question marks across the board. I think it is a consensus to conclude that Israel and the US have the capability to really hurt the Iranians, to destroy large parts of the military and nuclear infrastructure. However, it's a different thing to weaken these capabilities compared to completely eliminating or destroying these capabilities. And a complete destruction of military and nuclear capabilities solely on the basis of an air campaign is very hard to conceive. Partly, just more part because a lot of these.
Sorry, can you please all keep your microphones muted in the audience? Thank you. And back to you, David.
So realizing or completely destroying military and nuclear capabilities solely on the basis of an air campaign is very difficult because a lot of it is underground, and also getting hold of around 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium just by air power is very difficult to see how that can work. Similarly, a regime change exclusively with air campaign is a difficult objective. It would require one of two things in combination. On the one hand side, either significant elements of the Iranian security apparatus breaking the ranks from the regime and joining the opposition, and an organized and armed opposition. And so far, 2 weeks into the campaign, we've seen no indication of that happening. The attacks, and you all saw the pictures and videos, did of course do massive damage on Iran. However, they did not impair Iran's ability to conduct warfare, and crucially, it didn't break the chain of command. Iran has prepared for a scenario that we saw that large parts of its leadership will be decapitated, and has localized, decentralized command with large autonomies and predefined targets in the hands of local commanders. And we're seeing that unfolding. Now, before I conclude, perhaps a few words on the Iranian strategy. Iran, in my assessment, seeks to do two things, or to achieve two things with what it is doing at the moment. On the one hand side, and this is very obvious, it seeks to increase the political and economic costs for the attacking side in attacking Iran. From the very beginning, it has regionally expanded the conflict theater. It has obviously attacked Israeli and US interests in the region, with a particular focus on radar positions, which make it more difficult for the Israelis and Americans to intercept Iranian attacks. But it has, crucially from the very beginning, also targeted civilian infrastructure in the Gulf states, ports, airports, energy infrastructure. We saw the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Hezbollah in Lebanon has opened a second front or another front on Israel. And the idea is to maximize economic pain and to put pressure on local governments to use their influence over the Trump administration to convince them to cease hostilities, but also ultimately to put pressure on the Israeli electorate through high gasoline prices and the upcoming midterm elections. The second element, I think this is important also to bear in mind, that this is not just about this round of conflict, is to re-establish a sort of deterrence against the backdrop of Iran, or in the assessment of certain people inside the Iranian security discourse, are having responded with relative restraint to a series of events of the past year, starting in 2020 with the execution of Qasem Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guards commander, with the attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria, and then the Israeli attack on Iran in June last year. And the argument here that some are entertaining is that by responding with relative restraint, Iran has invited further strikes. And in the context of Israel having entertained what is called mowing the lawn, in different contexts of doing repeated rounds of attacks on certain targets over time, this is something that the Iranians want to avoid, and thereby sowing chaos at this point, creating maximum costs with the desire to make it as unattractive as possible for another round of Israeli-US attacks beyond this war.
Okay.
Now, the final point, I think what we're seeing on the Iranian side at this point is a asymmetrical war of attrition. In the very early phase of the war, they started to launch massive missile attacks that drained their silos, and also the Americans and Israelis succeeded in destroying significant numbers of Iranian missile launchers. Now they're moving to an approach where they do relatively limited campaign on broad range of targets, both military and civilian, with the desire to interrupt public and economic life in Israel and the Gulf states for as long as possible, in order to inflict pain on these countries, but also to inflict pain on the global economy. Maybe I'll leave it at this, and we can discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. There are already follow-up questions popping up. I wanted to ask you about what you see for the duration of the conflict going forward, as well as the military technology being employed. And perhaps we can pause these questions for a moment, because we are doing a bit of a hard cut now and shifting our attention to Ukraine, but also to the relationship between Iran and Russia, which I know that András can say a few words about. So over to you, András.
Thank you, and good morning again to all of you. Thank you for joining us today morning. When it comes, I will try to divide my remaining 4.5 minutes into two parts. First, military developments in the Ukraine war itself. In short, Ukraine survived Russia's winter campaign against the civilian energy infrastructure. Energy infrastructure is getting repaired, weather is getting warmer. Nowadays, in Kiev and the larger cities, electricity supply is restored. So it looks like that Russia's so far strongest air campaign against Ukraine's civilian population eventually failed. Caused considerable suffering, but Ukraine prevailed, and spring is coming already. When it comes to ground warfare, the most intensive fighting is still in the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka area, but Ukrainians are more or less holding the lines. So even though Pokrovsk has already fallen, the front line remains largely stable. The interesting developments happen on the southern front, where Ukraine's initially small kind of counter push has been developing into a limited counter-offensive. They have liberated already more than 400 square kilometers of territory. It's not that much. One needs to keep in mind that Ukraine is larger than 600,000 square kilometers of territory. Still in the south, the small recaptured or liberated territories have been enough to slow down and break Russia's offensive in the south. So basically the lesson to learn here, that Russia already lacks the manpower and the equipment to conduct two simultaneous large-scale offensive operations in the front line. They are focusing clearly on the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka and just don't have enough resources to support or actually to stabilize the front line in the south. Regarding the air war, Jan already mentioned it. Ukraine's experience encountering Russian drones is getting massively used finally, eventually, after 3 years. So the West, particularly the United States, is now catching up with a lesson that not only they, but we have also should have learned a long time ago, namely to build upon Ukraine's experience in producing cheap, reliable, mass-producible interceptor drones to counter the Russian drone threat. Ukrainian drone teams are getting deployed onto US bases in these very days. They will be online and in battle, in my uninformed guess, in 48 hours maximum. So the world is finally learning from Ukraine's experience. When it comes to the Russia-Iran connections, Russia is providing surprisingly little help, or at least what can be proven. Western sources reported that Russia is sharing targeting intelligence with the Iranians. Some Russian intelligence sharing would actually contribute to explaining the success of the initial strikes David mentioned, the initial Iranian strikes against US radar systems. So there is certainly some intelligence sharing and remarkably diplomatic expressions of support. The Kremlin congratulating the new supreme leader that Moscow stands behind you until the very end. They didn't really specify whose very end it was, but otherwise it looks like it reminds me a bit to the Syrian case, the last weeks and days of the Assad regime. Russia was providing, and now with Iran, providing some intelligence help, but otherwise couldn't do much, cannot do much, and they're clearly not ready to get engaged into an open military confrontation against US and Israeli combined forces. So I don't think that Russian contribution would be a game changer here. Russia is providing limited support, but not much else. So that's it from me for the start. Thank you again, and I'm here for the questions.
Thanks, András. And if I can just stay with you for a brief follow-up question, because I am interested in what you think about the extent to which Russia is a winner or loser of this situation. I mean, yes, you can argue that some of Russia's allies, Venezuela and now Iran, have been attacked and in some cases humiliated by the US. But on the other hand, there are these arguments about oil prices and about the attention that the West can pay to Ukraine's defense at the moment. So where do you sit your position yourself on that spectrum?
Just as David said, the key variable is the length of the conflict. I mean, oil prices are now higher than already have been for years. If this stays like that for long, then that would support the Russian budget massively. I mean, the Russian annual budget is planned with an oil price of $59 per barrel. Right now, it's more than 100. So if that stays long enough, then Russia would be able to resupply its budgets. But it again depends on how long the war is going on. What is clear is that the air defense missiles that Ukraine would gravely need, those advanced air defense missiles are now getting used in the Middle East, and new shipments are getting redirected to the Middle East. So this war is going to implicitly weaken Ukraine's air defense, important note, against ballistic missiles. Because against everything else, Ukraine is already using interceptor drones, fighter jets, helicopters, all that. Those are the ballistic missiles against which they still need the Patriots. I don't really see that Ukraine would receive any larger Patriot supplies anytime soon, because those missiles are now needed in the Middle East. So this would implicitly help Russia's air war, but again, not at a decisive scale.
That's a great segue into Élie Tenenbaum's remarks, I think, because now we will try and zoom out a little more and draw some of the lessons from the conflict in Ukraine, particularly on the aspect of military technology. So over to you, Élie.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jan, and to David and András for this also very insightful presentation. So I'll focus on a number of points that I've tried to highlight with my Ukrainian colleagues and also some Dutch colleagues after a number of extensive trips to Ukraine to try to collect lessons learned from the conflict, but also following closely what's happening right now in the Middle East. I will try to make some comparisons when it's interesting to do that. First, right now, the ongoing raging war in Ukraine has to be looked at in different areas. As András was saying, you have basically what's happening on the front line, and dozens of kilometers on one side or the other of the front line. This is what I call the close area. And then you have the rear and the deep battle. If you were to compare what's happening in the Middle East, you don't really have the close area right now in Iran because you don't have a land war going. So this is one big difference. If you look at whereas the close area is probably the one that is today the most emblematic of the war in Ukraine. If you look at this area, especially what we tend now to call the kill zone, which is about 20 to 50 kilometers from the forward line of forces, which doesn't really mean anything because you no longer really have a system of trenches, but rather a galaxy of foxholes that loosely describe what is the front. This kill zone is massively characterized by drone systems, which are not only providing striking missions, but also permanent observation, reconnaissance, and integrating the fires into what is now more and more understood as a kill web. So basically, if you talk to Ukrainian soldiers in the front line, they said that they cannot move because the first moment that they're moving, they're being seen, and if they're being seen, this information is transmitted to some form of shooter. Can be a drone, can be an artillery, can be a mortar, or can be an enemy infantry platoon, and they will be attacked. So this sort of bubble of connectivity, which creates extreme lethality on the close area, is definitely something that our own armed forces in Europe are not really prepared for. One in the number of drones, the mass use of drones, but also the massive use of counter drones tactics, including electronic warfare, which is another technology break, which is massively present on the battlefield in Ukraine, and finally AI, which is a way to enable the number of systems, autonomous systems, to sort of counter this barrier of electronic warfare, of jamming and listening in, and be more autonomous. What we're seeing now on the battlefield are drones that can, of course, navigate themselves through the battlefield and through massive jamming, but also lock on targets through target identification systems, and these are making more and more progress. It doesn't mean that they're fully autonomous from the moment that they, of course, take off to the moment where they attack, but you have increasingly important breaks of autonomy along the so-called kill chain. Now, if I take a step backwards and look at the rear area or the deep area, which is absolutely key, even when you talk to Ukrainian strategists or commanders, they tell you that what is really the center of gravity for them is usually when what the band that they would call beyond the 30-40 kilometers line after the front and up to 200, 400 kilometers. In the 300 kilometers beyond the front line, I've been told that they probably 70% of Russian high value systems. So if the Ukrainians can get there and can strike it systematically, they can break the back of the Russian army. But right now it's very difficult to get there. They're getting there, but not necessarily in sufficient number. And then beyond the 400 kilometers, then you have a very rear deep, which you will find the refineries, you will find the cities, and you will find more of a stretching system, which is what the Russians are managing to target right now. Is of course the Shaheeds that you also see in the Iran conflict, but as András was saying, the ballistic missiles, which are of course much more much faster with heavier payload and making much more damage and much more difficult to intercept, especially when you're short on those Patriot systems. Yes.
Sorry
Okay.
sorry to interrupt, Élie. Can I just ask a quick follow-up question, and to allow you to perhaps also to finish your point, because András mentioned the ability of Ukraine to export capabilities on drones. Perhaps you can say a word about that, so what we can actually learn from Ukraine.
Of course. So the Ukrainians have developed increasingly impressive skills on the counter Shahed part with mobile air defense teams and cheap economical salvos, so that you do not spend $1 million Patriot interceptor for each Shahed. So I think this is the kind of interceptors that they are willing to export as a technology, probably not as systems, because the systems they would need, but the technology and the know-how they can export. Also now increasingly working with European and some US company in drone interceptors. So these are small vertical launching drones, such as the Bagnet or the X-Wing, which are vertically launched and are intercepting the Shaheds with an economical ratio. This is very important to think that the prices of the interceptors is not just about the prices per se, because the price decides the volume, the number, and when you face with saturation, it's very important to find the right volume in terms of interception, so you can sustain this.
Okay. And it's interesting that you mentioned the economics of warfare, because I already saw questions asking about the ability of Europeans to engage and support in several theaters of war at the same time. And we'll turn to some of the questions in the audience now. They are already pouring in the chat. I encourage everyone to also raise your hand and ask them in person. It's always nice to see faces and hear voices. But let me pick up a question by Stefan Schumacher, who's asking about the decision-making of US President Trump, which is not easy to decipher. But still, if we could try and look into the drivers behind his decision-making, home political reasons, certainly also the markets, I would add. If there's anything that we can learn from US decision-making over the past couple of weeks, that's a good guess for anyone here on the panel, I guess. But there's certainly a question or two for David, one by Tim Stickings from The National. He's asking about the information war in Iran, especially with AI images flooding social media. So who's winning the information war? And there was another question, I think, that David, you would like perhaps to pick up on, of Alexander Kreshenetsky, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. If the attacks on European bases in the Middle East, British in particular, if that will continue to happen, if that's possible to divert European attention to Ukraine. Let's let's stay with those three questions for starters, and I will pick up more as we go along. David, would you like to start?
Sure. Trying to understand what Trump may or may not intend is a difficult task for all of us. So I'm also not a particular US expert, so I have my ideas, but you know, treat that with a bit of caution. My assumption is that I guess Trump believed, against the backdrop of his campaign in Venezuela and about what some of his allies may have told him, that a campaign against Iran, a strike against the supreme leader, will produce a quick and swift victory, and that he can do what no one else in history, in the US history, was able to do over the past 47 years, getting rid of the Islamic Republic, or at least substantially weakening it. And I think it's clear that if that was the starting point, it didn't go to plan. Now, beyond this, at least the way, to the extent that I can follow the US discourse on this, I mean, there are discussions, of course, to use the momentum now to also realize strategic objectives. And one such objective could be, for example, to prevent the Iranians from continuing to export oil by, for example, seizing oil export terminals, Khark Island, and so on, by re-establishing control over the Strait of Hormuz, even though it doesn't look as if that goes to plan at this point in time. But by then, I mean, if the Americans would really control the Strait of Hormuz and moving forward, they would have substantial geoeconomic power over China, which sources the bulk of its energy imports from the Gulf region. So I think in that context, there are some ways of trying to rationalize or using the momentum to also achieve strategic objectives, though I don't think this was the initial objective from the start. And yeah, we see the range of contradicting statements coming out of the Trump White House these days, where basically every day there is a different objective, a different assessment as for the war. And this goes perhaps to the next point, the info war. I mean, it's perhaps a bit rude to answer it with a counter question, but do we have the impression that this war goes to plan? And I think we will all agree that we don't have the impression that it goes to plan. We see what is happening to the global economy. We see what is happening to the region, the destruction. And here, I guess, even if some of the pictures are AI manipulated, there are still a lot of very alarming pictures that are not AI generated. This morning, we woke up to the image of a burning oil tanker in the Gulf. We see the destruction at hotels, at Dubai airport, at US consulates, at US positions in the region. We don't see so much out of Israel, but the things that we are seeing, it also suggests that there is quite significant damage there. So I think at the global level, if the point is showing that the Israelis and the Americans are not securing a quick and swift victory, the Iranians are winning that information battle. However, I would also make another point, is that the internet is off in Iran. The Iranians are maintaining strict censorship over what is happening there. There is obviously also a lot of destruction in Iran, a lot of suffering. And in this context, there are some points that I think we should not forget. And the first is Iranian civil society. We saw almost 2 months ago, at the beginning of the year, brutal crackdown on Iranian protesters, with thousands, if not 10,000s, being killed by the regime. We now see that protest has been further criminalized on the grounds as collaboration with the enemy. Across Iranian cities, there are checkpoints. So this situation is very tense. And the fact that the Iranians succeeding in securing certain tactical, if not strategic objectives in the context of the war, it doesn't mean that everything is perfect domestically. I think this is also a side of the story that we should not forget. And a further point, referring to the new supreme leader, the son of Ali Khamenei, Mujtaba Khamenei, he hasn't been seen ever since becoming supreme leader. And they're trying to spin that as well. But there are rumors, of course, as to his health status, and as to the role that he actually plays these days in decision-making in the country. I would assume he's rather weak at this point. So this is also a point that doesn't get so much attention in the discourse in Europe, but is also so important if you look at the information dimension of the war.
Probably also quite dangerous to appear in public. But yes, the final point on the European basis.
On Cyprus, It's interesting because the strikes on Cyprus have been different from what the Iranians were doing closer to their territory in the Middle East and the Gulf region, where they basically put an Iranian flag on top of every attack that they did. In Cyprus, they're saying they didn't do it. Presumably, the drone started in Lebanon, was launched by Hezbollah. I think there are two dimensions here. First is that it's a bit of tit for tat and payback for the fact that the Brits allowed the Americans to use Diego Garcia for attacks on Iran. So there's a bit of payback on that front. And the second point is, I think they learned from the Russians and how the Russians are doing warfare there, is to test European resolve by creating that ambiguity, saying we didn't do it, though everyone assumes they did it. And they see how the Europeans and the Brits will respond to this. And I think this is the dimension there, though I wouldn't assume that this is a primary objective to really expand warfare into that with the desire to kind of also shift resources away and get the Europeans really dragged into that conflict. It might be a side effect, but not the key objective here.
Thanks, David, for a very comprehensive answer. But maybe András and Élie have things to add. And even if you don't have anything to add, there are more questions. So let me just throw in one more question along the way, because Götz Schellas is asking about credible evidence of back-channel US-China communication aimed at de-escalating the Iran conflict. So if you have any information about that, that's another question that you might take a stab at. But did you want to add to some of the previous points? Élie, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly on, I think Trump and information warfare are very much linked, because for Trump, what matters is information, not necessarily as warfare, but as the narrative, the political narrative that he can sell to his constituency. And I think that given the very, very high level of ambition that he started with, it will be super hard for him to paint it as a success if he still has the regime with the ayatollahs and the mullahs and in place, as it will probably be and remain in the foreseeable future, unless we start to see some cracks in the system. But we haven't really seen any massive defection or anything like that for the regime. And if Trump, some people said that he may just declare victory and decide to call it a day. I can hardly see how it will not be painted as a massive victory for Iran, just to have been able to preserve the regime. On the other hand, if the oil prices keep going up, and the backlash, the economic backlash of the whole thing is just increasing out and spiraling out of control, it will be hard for Trump to just keep on insisting on the operation. Finally, on the Europeans, one quick thought on the technological aspects. For 4 years now, we have been as experts, I think, trying to shake the European defense industry to say you need to look at this more economical way, especially in terms of air defense faced with low-cost drones, and you need to move up with this. And one of the responses that I had, especially in France, was that the war in Ukraine is very specific, and we don't necessarily need to develop a lot of systems based on the Ukraine requirements, on the drone thing and everything. And by the way, we have good customers in the Middle East, which are buying our very exquisite, very small number, but very high tech interceptor systems, and we're fine with this. I think that now the Europeans finding themselves both for their own facilities that have been attacked in the Middle East, but also for the customers in the Middle East, in a situation where they will have to follow the Ukrainian requirements, because these are the same systems that are attacking Ukraine and attacking our Gulf allies. And sometimes I feel very frustrated, because it feels like if we had started to implement the lessons from Ukraine 4 years ago, now we would have solutions for both our allies and our facilities in the region.
András, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just two short things. One on the information warfare aspect, and one is a direct continuation of what Élie said. When it comes to the information warfare of the aspect, it's very hard to override reality. One can shape reality, but from the information war perspective, this one of the first attacks of this war, or one of the first set of images, besides, of course, burning Iranian cities, was the attack on the school. The mistaken US attack on the elementary school on the 28th of February, killing more than 170 people on the ground, and that thing was real. One of the first images coming from the war, that a massive missile struck children's school and killed way too many of them. And this already shaped the information environment. And by now, based on the preliminary inquiry, you all know it much better than I do. Military history is full of such cases. Mistaken target identification, targeting problems, malfunctioning weapons. Nobody intended to hit that school, yet it happened. So information warfare aspects have been shaped by this initial very unfortunate strike. So that was the first. Second thing, when it comes to possible redirecting European sources, European weapon systems from Ukraine to the Middle East, here I think details matter a lot. Most of the European weapon systems provided to Ukraine are actually for ground war. Armored vehicles, artillery ammunition, spare parts, things like that. Everybody focuses on the air defense missiles, but those constitute a very small minority of the overall amount and variety of the systems provided. And as there is no major ground operation against Iran, is not on the agenda, or at least doesn't seem to be viable. I don't yet see the reason why Europe would strategically reshape the support given to Ukraine. Air defense gets affected, sure, but not other aspects of the support. And what Élie said about the cheap interceptor drones, when it comes to supporting Ukraine in these things, Ukrainians keep telling to everyone, give us more money, because the technology for producing these drones they already have. It's the financial resources that they are short of. One example is open source. One can tell it. One of these small interceptor drones, the P1 Sun interceptor drones, and in Ukrainian it's a word joke, but it's a politically incorrect one, so I'm not going to say it. One of these interceptor drones cost approximately $4,000 per each. The United States is paying $15,000 for them each. So the extra money will go into the drone production in Ukraine to speed up the numbers of drone produced. So in the short run, what Ukraine needs is money, not that much hardware when it comes to air defense. I don't see that Europe would need to redirect the money flows. Thank you.
And that's perhaps a separate conversation about European money and the Hungarian veto of more Ukrainian support. But let me pick up a question by Klaus Wittmann.
Good morning. I would like to thank András for some encouragement on Ukraine in his initial statement. And I keep fighting for the deep strike weapons here in Germany. And I keep guessing why Trump still holds on to Putin. Should not the Russian support for Iran with intelligence data at last convince him that Putin is not his friend? And a second question to the panel, would you agree that US and Israel has not only miscalculated on the Iranian backfighting, but also on the following points? Not only that fighting from the air is not enough, as David emphasized, and as we have seen already in Kosovo and in Gaza, but also that Iran is not a one-person dictatorship which you just need to decapitate. And thirdly, and most importantly, that toppling a regime is by far not yet regime change. Lessons which we should have learned in the last 20, 30 years. What do you say?
Right, thanks a lot. So US miscalculations on several fronts, Putin not being Trump's friend, and also the ability of Iran to defend and strike back. Who would like to go first? András, go ahead.
That's going to be very, very, very quick and easy. Sometimes I'm happy being a Russian specialist. So for me, it's enough to try to understand the Kremlin's thinking, so I don't have to make hopeless efforts understanding Trump's thinking. What we see on the US policy, not the US president's policy, but the US policy vis-a-vis Russia, there are ups and downs, but I see kind of a sobering up effort. And in terms of trends, it's fairly visible in the Ukraine war that in the last few months, roughly 4 or 5 months, Ukraine started to receive way more accurate targeting intelligence information than they did before. And the question comes from, where does this intel come from? So there is the US policy on Russia is not only about Trump, it's about several layers of the administration. So I'm still cautiously optimistic on that.
And before handing over to the others to touch on those questions as well, let me throw in another question in the chat by Lutz Uphoff, who's asking about Israel's and Netanyahu's role in determining objectives, strategy, and perhaps also the length of the war in Iran. So, David, would you like to go next, perhaps?
Sure. On the first question of the degree to which the system is institutionalized, my assumption is that Iran experts in the Pentagon, the CIA, they have a clear grasp of what is going on in Iran, of the situation. The question is whether or not they can convey their information to those taking the decisions in the White House. And here I think the big question mark is there. That perhaps those in the US around Trump who made the decision for that war were thinking that similar to Venezuela, it's sufficient to take out one person and then coerce the rest to follow your orders. But the way in which Iran is organized, the political system, with its own unique checks and balances, its over-institutionalizations with a plethora of different institutions that are keeping each other in check, and also the degree of elite cohesion, a very fragmented system, a lot of infighting and competition. But when it comes to regime survival, what we saw, there's been a fair degree of cohesion. I think these are points that at least those who thought that this could be a quick and swift victory did not fully take into account. As for regime toppling versus regime change, I guess, again, the situation is different for the Israelis than for the Americans. I don't think the Americans have an interest in a regime collapse in Iran against the backdrop of the ripple effect that this would have for regional stability, for the Gulf states, for the Caucasus, for the Levant, and so on. As for the Israelis, I'm not sure if perhaps they could be very happy with an outcome where the regime loses the monopoly of violence of the entirety of the Iranian territory, where there are uprisings, infighting, and so on. Again, this is, I think, a risky thing because against the backdrop of the decentralization of the Iranian military structures, you have military assets spread across the country, and one should ask questions as to what would happen to these assets when they fall into the hands of certain actors. But again, here I think the primary objective is to weaken the country as such. I think in this point, in regard to this point, it's also worthwhile to acknowledge that in the Israeli discourse, you see some of the civilian infrastructure being designated as IRGC infrastructure. For example, ports, refineries, energy infrastructure are being described as belonging to the IRGC. And on the commercial side, they are, in fact, in many cases run by the IRGC. But that is or may be used as a justification to really go after this type of infrastructure, which could then bring us closer to a scenario where the system collapses. As for the duration of the war, I think at this point it's worthwhile to acknowledge that both Iran and Israel think they can gain more from continuing the fighting than from stopping it. The Iranians, because they think they can reestablish deterrence, they can bring about a lot of pain economically, politically, militarily on the region and the world, and this plays in their favor. And I think the Israelis are thinking that a lot of items on their list, a lot of targets have not been hit yet, and this may extend to also elements of what is effectively civilian infrastructure in Iran. And as for Trump, I can't really say as to what would make him take a decision to stop the fighting. He already said that this would be a joint decision with the Israelis. So I think for now, in moving forward, both sides or all sides have an interest. I think a few points to watch: the question of interceptors, which are running low. I think the Americans have already used more interceptors in the Middle East in these few days than they did in the entirety of the war in Ukraine. It's interesting to see how much of a change the emergence of Ukrainian interceptors will make in this respect. Question of how long Iran will be able to continue its oil exports is also a different point. I mean, they've in fact increased their oil exports strangely in this situation because they control the Strait of Hormuz. The finance side of it is also a point, but I don't really see a clear tipping point that would allow us to say if that happens, the fighting will end. I think we should at least prepare for the possibility of continued warfare for quite some time.
Élie?
Yeah, I think that wrapping up all the questions together, but the Netanyahu influence and the air war campaign, regime change versus regime toppling, all together, I think it's pretty fair to say that the overall strategic rationale for what's happening in Iran today is probably the one that has an Israeli one rather than a US one, which is basically the software, the new military software that the Israeli power has enforced since October 7th. Since October 7th, both against Hamas, Hezbollah, and now Iran, and the idea is to conduct an air war with, of course, a heavy intelligence and massive strike to degrade your enemy to a level where its capabilities and capacities, overall governance capacity, not only the combat capability, are so low that it can be either overthrown by another political force, be it the Lebanese state in the case of Hezbollah, or the potential protests in Iran, or if it isn't, then it doesn't matter because it's so crippled, then it can no longer pose a threat to you. And they don't really care about the political settlement that goes behind this. And in this, it is different from the regime change that we've seen in the Middle East in the early 2000s in the aftermath of 9/11s, where the United States did topple regimes to replace it by something that they had, in mind, even if it was naive, even if it was, but they had some sort of clear idea of what they wanted to do with those countries. Now, it's no about about that, because in the Israeli rationale, I think that it has pervaded through the U.S. strategic rationale. It's about basically destroying your enemy, bringing it to its knees, and then if something happens at the political level, then is the best or not. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't matter because they so crippled that they can no longer pose a threat to you. I think this is what they have in mind.
Mm-hmm. Staying with the economic costs of these wars for a little longer, and not just the primary military costs, but also the energy prices and the knock-on effects. We haven't really talked about the European side. I mean, the American decision-making is obviously to a certain extent bound on market behavior and the mood in the upcoming midterm elections. But we also have upcoming elections in this country, in Germany. And we have record prices at petrol stations, etc. So I'm not sure about the situation in France, Élie, but perhaps we can say a few words about where you expect the mood in European public opinion to shift if those wars drag on and incur more and more costs. Where do you see things going? The upcoming election in Hungary as well, by the way, András, looking at you.
I'm speaking for France, so
Yes.
sorry, and not speaking for the rest of Europe, which is very un-French for me. But I think that you have a French interest in the Middle East. The President Macron reminded that there are 400,000 French in the region, and so you have first nationals. Of course, you have economic impact. And you also have security and alliance interests. So it explains why we are deploying some capabilities, most of them sea-based, maritime, and then right now the interest is to preserve the maritime security, so probably along the lines of what you saw in the Red Sea after the Houthis started to disrupt the maritime traffic in the aftermath of October 7th. Now it's going to be much more difficult in the Arabian Gulf to do that, and especially the Strait of Hormuz, given the capabilities of the Iranians, especially the sea mines that they may start to deploy. I don't really see, neither the will nor the means to massively weigh on the strategic, direction of the conflict. So in the meantime, the Europeans will have to suffer in a way the consequences and try to mitigate its impact on their most direct security and economic interest. But I'm afraid that they will remain some spectator to the show rather than actual actors.
David, perhaps a word on reactions in and from Germany.
Sure. I think along the same line, Germany is not in a position to wield substantial influence over any other warring parties, yet it is confronted with the economic and security fallout from that conflict. And you already referred to high fuel prices that is already casting its shadow over several elections in federal states that are upcoming this year. We see inflation pressures, especially if the conflict continues, and some economists even predict that the recovery of the German economy might be undone if high energy prices persist over time. So I think on that side, we are already very clearly seeing the effects. And beyond that, we're seeing that also particularly in Ukraine, when interceptors are being diverted from Ukraine, when other ammunition is diverted, when there's less attention on what the Russians are doing, which may allow them to expand attacks on the country, also targeting civilian infrastructure in going forward. And add to this another layer, our entire argument towards Ukraine is of sorts a normative argument. It's saying that what the Russians are doing is against international law. You should not be allowed to change borders by force. There should be a just peace. International law should also be acknowledged during warfare. And in the way that leading politicians from Germany, including the Chancellor, have given support to the Israeli-American war on Iran, basically calling international law as irrelevant, is weakening our argument there. And what is making matters worse, in my view, is that I think most countries in the broader Middle East are sharing the same objectives that at least Germany and I think most other European countries are also sharing. And that is to prevent an escalation of the conflict, to ensure that there's a quick ceasefire, that the situation does not get out of control. And here I think it's even more remarkable that Germany then positions itself away from most countries in the region instead to use that for a coordinated diplomatic initiative, acknowledging the limits of what Germany could actually realize. But still, I think it was unwise to extend support for a war that is harming German interests and European interests on so many levels.
Right. We have time for one final comment by András. And András, if you would like to, perhaps you could also say a word on European help to Ukraine. Commission President von der Leyen has promised that the European Union will deliver the loan on one way or the other. So where do you see things on that front, and perhaps also a word on Hungary, if you want to. We've got about a minute and a half left.
Nice, thank you. No, when it comes to the European support, based on the data Eurobarometer and the annual Eurobarometer surveys, there are always two of them, one in the spring, one in the autumn. Eurobarometer surveys consistently show that the Euro support for Ukraine is decreasing a bit, but still the project enjoys absolute majority among European citizens. So really in terms of financial support, humanitarian support, taking care of the refugees, all this, decisive majority of the entire EU population is still in favor of maintaining the support. So I don't think that that this would decrease, even if fuel prices go a bit higher. Again, the key variable is how long the current war against Iran is going to last. When it comes to the 90 billion, thanks to the smaller IMF contribution, Ukraine's acute cash shortage problem seems to be solved. So right now, probably, I mean, Hungary is going to have parliamentary elections on the 12th of April. If the opposition wins, still it would take 4 to 6 weeks for the new government to come actually into office. But still, with the IMF help, Ukraine can stay afloat financially until it turns out whether there is a change in Hungary or not. If Viktor Orban stays on power, then of course the EU will have to find another solution for the 90 billion loan or give substantial concessions to Orban. If the opposition wins, that would be a fundamental different story. The Hungarian opposition doesn't speak much about foreign policy, but what they say is that they would plan to become again a reliable, constructive player in the European Union. So if the opposition wins, I'm kind of optimistic about the future of the 90 billion loans. But again, we need to see 31 more days are left until the elections. Thank you.
András, David, Élie, thank you so much for your expertise this morning. Thanks all for tuning in, and see you soon back at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Bye-bye.